Sean Diddy Combs just filed an emergency appeal demanding immediate release from prison, claiming the judge defied the jury's verdict and gave him the longest sentence in history for a crime that normally gets 15 months. His lawyers say Judge Arun Subramanian acted like a 13th juror, used evidence from charges Diddy was acquitted of, and turned 2 prostitution convictions into a 4-year nightmare based on freak-offs the jury said weren't coercive. This is Diddy's last shot at freedom, and the legal argument is actually compelling. Here's why he might win. Let's start with what happened on December 23, 2025 because this is breaking news that changes everything. Diddy's legal team filed a massive appeal with the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals in Manhattan. They're asking for 3 possible outcomes. Option 1, acquit Diddy completely and let him walk free. Option 2, order his immediate release from prison right now. Option 3, send the case back to Judge Subramanian and force him to dramatically reduce the sentence. This isn't a routine appeal, this is an aggressive legal challenge that questions the entire foundation of Diddy's conviction and sentencing. The central argument is explosive. Diddy's lawyers, led by appellate attorney Alexandra Shapiro, claim that Judge Subramanian essentially overruled the jury. In July 2025, after a trial, the jury acquitted Diddy of the 2 most serious charges he was facing: racketeering, conspiracy, and sex trafficking. Those were the big ones, the charges that painted him as the head of a criminal enterprise who coerced women into sex against their will. The jury said no, we don't believe that happened. Not guilty. But Diddy was convicted on 2 lesser charges. Transportation to engage in prostitution. That's a Mann Act violation, which means transporting someone across state lines for any sexual crime. The jury found him guilty of doing that with 2 women. But here's the crucial detail: the jury did not find that Diddy used force, fraud, or coercion. They convicted him of prostitution offenses that didn't require any of those elements. Basically, the jury said he transported women for sex work, but they didn't say he forced them to do it. Normally, according to Diddy's lawyers, someone convicted of those exact offenses gets sentenced to less than 15 months in prison. Even when coercion is involved, which the jury explicitly did not find in Diddy's case, typical sentences are around 15 months. Federal sentencing guidelines for Mann Act violations without aggravating factors support this. So Diddy's legal team expected somewhere in that range, maybe a bit higher given his profile, but nothing extreme. Instead, Judge Subramanian sentenced him to 50 months. That's 4 years and 2 months. More than 3 times the typical sentence for these specific crimes. The longest sentence ever imposed for any remotely similar defendant according to the appeal filing. And Diddy's lawyers are saying that's because the judge looked at all the evidence about the acquitted charges and essentially retried Diddy himself, found him guilty of things the jury said he didn't do, and then punished him for it anyway. Here's how that played out at sentencing in October 2025. 2 of Diddy's ex-girlfriends testified at trial. Cassie Ventura, who everyone knows from her decade-long relationship with Diddy that ended in 2018. And a second woman who testified under the pseudonym Jane. Both of them described horrific abuse. Cassie said Diddy ordered her to have disgusting sex with strangers hundreds of times during their relationship. The jury saw video of Diddy dragging and beating Cassie in a Los Angeles hotel hallway after one of these multi-day freak-off sessions. Jane said she was pressured into hotel nights, drug-fueled sexual encounters from 2021 to 2024 that could last for days. That testimony was presented to support the sex trafficking and racketeering charges. The prosecution's theory was that Diddy coerced, exploited, and forced these women to have sex with male sex workers while he watched and filmed, sometimes masturbating. That he ran a criminal enterprise built around this abuse. The jury heard all of that and said we don't believe the prosecution proved coercion or a criminal conspiracy. Not guilty on those charges. But at sentencing, Judge Subramanian said he considered Combs' treatment of these 2 former girlfriends when calculating the prison term. He explicitly said he was taking into account the beatings, the coercion, the multi-day freak-offs, all the conduct that the jury had rejected as part of the acquitted charges. The judge said Combs abused the power and control he had over the lives of women he professed to love dearly, that he abused them physically, emotionally, and psychologically, and used that abuse to get his way, especially when it came to freak-offs and hotel nights. Diddy's lawyers are now arguing that's unconstitutional. You can't use conduct the jury explicitly acquitted you of to dramatically increase your sentence. That violates the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial. If a jury says you're not guilty of coercion, the judge can't turn around and say, "But I think you did coerce them, so I'm going to sentence you as if you were convicted of coercion." That's the judge acting as a 13th juror, inserting his own findings of fact over the jury's verdict. The appeal brief is scathing. It says the judge defied the jury's verdict and found Combs coerced, exploited, and forced his girlfriends to have sex and led a criminal conspiracy. These judicial findings trumped the verdict and led to the highest sentence ever imposed for any remotely similar defendant. It argues that defendants typically get sentenced to less than 15 months for these prostitution offenses even when coercion is involved. But Combs got a sentence more than 3 times as long despite the acquittals. One particularly interesting line in the filing quotes Judge Subramanian saying at some point, "Illegal activity can't be laundered into constitutionally protected activity just by the desire to watch it." Diddy's lawyers quoted that and then added in parentheses whatever that means. That's appellate attorney shade right there. They're basically saying the judge was spouting philosophical nonsense to justify going way beyond what the jury convicted Diddy of. There's actually solid legal ground for this argument. The use of acquitted conduct in sentencing has been controversial for years. In 2024, the U.S. Sentencing Commission revised the guidelines to discourage judges from relying heavily on acquitted conduct when determining sentences. Multiple federal judges and legal scholars have argued it's fundamentally unfair. You have a constitutional right to a jury trial, but if the judge can just use evidence from charges you were acquitted of to increase your sentence anyway, that right becomes meaningless. The counterargument, which the prosecution will definitely make, is that judges have always had broad discretion in sentencing. The jury decides guilty or not guilty. The judge decides the punishment within the statutory range. And judges are allowed to consider all relevant conduct, including uncharged conduct or conduct related to acquitted charges, when making that determination. The idea is that the jury's acquittal doesn't mean the conduct didn't happen, it just means the prosecution didn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. But at sentencing, the judge only needs to find conduct by a preponderance of the evidence, a much lower standard. But Diddy's team is arguing that in this case, the reliance on acquitted conduct wasn't just a factor, it was the driving force behind the sentence. They're saying Judge Subramanian essentially re-prosecuted the sex trafficking and racketeering case during sentencing, found Diddy guilty in his own mind, and then imposed a sentence appropriate for those serious crimes even though the jury said not guilty. That crosses the line from discretion into overreach. The stakes here are massive. Diddy is 56 years old. He's currently incarcerated at FCI Fort Dix, a federal prison in New Jersey. His projected release date is May 8, 2028. That's 2.5 more years from now. If the appeal succeeds and he gets released immediately, he walks free after serving about 16 months total since his arrest in September 2024. If the sentence gets reduced to the typical 15 months for these offenses, he's out almost immediately because he's already served longer than that. If the convictions get overturned entirely, he's completely exonerated and can sue for wrongful imprisonment. But if the appeal fails, Diddy sits in prison for another 2.5 years, and his legacy is permanently tainted as a convicted sex offender who ran freak-off sessions and abused women even if the jury technically didn't convict him of the worst allegations. The court of public opinion has already convicted him. Most people believe Cassie and Jane. Most people have seen that hotel hallway video of him dragging and kicking Cassie. Even if he wins this appeal on technical legal grounds, his reputation is destroyed. The Second Circuit Court of Appeals hasn't scheduled oral arguments yet. These things can take months. But the fact that Diddy's team filed this on December 23rd, right before Christmas when most of the legal world shuts down, suggests urgency. They want this in front of judges as soon as possible. They're arguing fundamental constitutional violations, which appellate courts take very seriously. Diddy's representative put out a statement saying the appeal argues that the district court imposed a record-setting sentence by relying on conduct the jury explicitly rejected, in direct conflict with the 2024 sentencing guidelines and core constitutional principles. That's strong language. They're not just saying the sentence was too harsh, they're saying it was unconstitutional, that it violated guidelines, and that it creates a precedent that threatens everyone's jury trial rights. If the appellate court agrees with even part of this argument, it could have huge implications beyond just Diddy's case. It would be a significant ruling on the limits of judicial discretion in sentencing, clarifying that judges cannot simply disregard jury verdicts and impose sentences based on conduct the jury explicitly rejected. That would be a win for criminal defense lawyers across the country who've been fighting against the use of acquitted conduct in sentencing for years. But let's be real about something. Diddy is not a sympathetic defendant. The public knows about the abuse allegations. We've all seen the Cassie video. His own ex-employees have come forward with stories about his behavior. Multiple women have accused him of similar patterns of abuse over decades. Even if the jury didn't convict him of sex trafficking and racketeering, most people believe he did those things and just had good enough lawyers to create reasonable doubt. So even if Diddy wins this appeal on technical legal grounds, he's not winning in the court of public opinion. His music career is over. His business empire has crumbled. Nobody wants to work with him. His sons have distanced themselves publicly. He's radioactive in the entertainment industry. Getting out of prison early doesn't change any of that. The prosecution's response to this appeal will be interesting. They'll argue that Judge Subramanian acted well within his discretion, that the evidence of abuse and coercion was overwhelming even if the jury had reasonable doubt on the specific legal elements of sex trafficking, and that a 50-month sentence for someone who orchestrated years of abuse against multiple women is actually quite lenient. They'll point out that the Federal Probation Department recommended 70 to 87 months, so even Judge Subramanian's sentence was below the recommended guidelines. They'll also argue that Diddy's lawyers are mischaracterizing what happened at sentencing. The judge wasn't retrying the acquitted charges, he was considering relevant conduct that helps explain the nature and circumstances of the crimes Diddy was convicted of. The prostitution offenses didn't happen in a vacuum. They were part of a broader pattern of behavior that the judge was entitled to consider when determining an appropriate punishment. And they'll point out that Diddy is an extraordinarily wealthy and powerful man who used that wealth and power to abuse women for years. That his crimes involved manipulation, control, and exploitation of vulnerable people. That he showed no remorse, no accountability, and has consistently portrayed himself as the victim. From the prosecution's perspective, 50 months is a gift considering what Diddy actually did. But regardless of all that context, the legal question remains. Can a judge use evidence from charges a jury acquitted you of to dramatically increase your sentence? And if the jury explicitly found that coercion was not present in your crimes, can the judge sentence you as if coercion was present? Those are the questions the Second Circuit will have to answer. And depending on how they rule, it could either set Diddy free or establish that judges have almost unlimited power to impose whatever sentence they think is appropriate regardless of what the jury actually convicted someone of. As of Christmas Day 2025, Diddy sits in a federal prison cell in New Jersey, waiting to see if this appeal will save him. His lawyers have made a compelling argument that his constitutional rights were violated. The appellate court will review the trial record, the sentencing hearing transcript, and the legal precedents. They'll hear arguments from both sides. And eventually, probably sometime in 2026, they'll issue a ruling that determines whether Diddy serves another 2.5 years or walks free. This is Diddy's last real shot. If the Second Circuit denies the appeal, he could try to take it to the Supreme Court, but they only hear a tiny fraction of cases, and this probably isn't significant enough to grab their attention. So this appeal is basically it. Either he wins and his sentence gets reduced or overturned, or he loses and he's in prison until 2028. The timing of this filing, right before Christmas while everyone's attention is elsewhere, is strategic. It allows the legal team to get it into the system without as much media scrutiny. But now that it's public, the story is exploding. Everyone's talking about whether Diddy deserves another chance, whether the judge overstepped, whether the sentence was too harsh or too lenient, whether this is a case about legal technicalities or about a powerful man trying to escape consequences for abusing women. What we know for certain is that Sean Diddy Combs, once one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop, is fighting for his freedom from a prison cell using arguments about judicial overreach and constitutional rights. His lawyers claim he got the longest sentence in history for crimes that normally get 15 months, all because a judge ignored the jury's verdict and sentenced him based on charges he was acquitted of. The appellate court will decide if that argument has merit or if Diddy is just a convicted criminal trying to game the system. Either way, this appeal is the story that will dominate headlines until there's a ruling. Diddy's fate hangs in the balance, and the entire legal world is watching.